Good morning, everybody, on this cold morning. Welcome to the Wilson Center. We're glad to have you here today for the discussion of the Global Women's Leadership Initiative Leadership Index. So I'm honored to have you. I'm Gwen Young, the director of the Global Women's Leadership Initiative and the Women in Public Service Project here at the Wilson Center. So for those of you who don't know, the Women in Public Service Project has a goal of accelerating global progress towards women's equal participation in policy and political leadership in order to create more dynamic and inclusive institutions, to leverage the full potential of the world's population, and to change the way global solutions are forged. So we're here today to talk about one of our tools and the role of data and index, inclusivity, and how do you measure progress towards this goal. So I'm going to do a quick introduction to our tool. Then we're going to have a couple different panels talking about why this tool is important, what they're doing to accelerate gender parity, and we'll open it up to questions. So our tool is called the Global Women's Leadership Initiative Index, or the Leadership Index for short. And we chose an index and we chose a data framework because we want to drive institutional and systemic change, but also because we want to measure all dimensions of leadership and all factors that influence leadership. As we know, leadership is not simply holding an office. It's what you do when you're in office that matters, whether that's in the private sector or in the public sector. We also chose an index because we want to develop an evidence base. We want to show why this matters beyond the normative, beyond the numbers of women comprise 50.7% of the population, but we want to show why it matters that women assume leadership positions. And I'll take a step back just to sort of set the context for what an index is before I talk about our index, right? An index is a framework that lets you show the relations between indicators, factors, what I'm calling levers, and you can show progress over time. So one of the first indexes was the Consumer Price Index. Another index that I think everybody uses is the U.S. News and World Report Index. So we are not that, but we might be someday. No, we're not that, and we're not that for a couple of reasons. Our index is unique in that we are not ranking countries. The aim of the index is not to say the Bahamas is the best and Canada is the worst. The aim of the index is to allow countries, institutions, political parties, the private sector, show how a country's doing in terms of gender parity. Our index is unique as well because we measure the 5 sectors of government, right? So we're not just talking about women presidents or women in the legislature, we're talking about women in the civil service. We're talking about women in the security sector, in police forces. We're talking about women in the judiciary. Our index is also unique in that we're measuring the national level as well as the local level, and we're weighting those equally, right? So we're talking about women city commissioners, we're talking about women presidents, we're talking about women in municipal councils, and women in Congress or parliaments. The third reason this index is unique is we're trying to work off data visualization. Right, so we're trying to interpret this data for you. It's an online platform at the moment. All of the data is accessible. You can download the data. So this is in the spirit of trying to make gender parity and trying to make what a government is doing in terms of leadership transparent to everybody in terms of governance and transparent in terms of how are we doing in your governments looking like the communities that you serve. And the other reason it's unique, and we're going to talk about today, is in terms of our methodology. We call it the 3 Ps, pathways, positions, and power. And I was just thinking about this morning. It gives you this sort of 3D look at leadership, right? So the pathways is how do you get into a career? So the pathways indicators look at education, labor force participation, financial inclusion, access to the internet. How many days does it take to start a business? Legal protections, right? Is there an equality clause in your Constitution? Are there quotas? Are there sexual harassment laws and legislation? So what are these types of protections that would allow women and girls to have access to the labor force? The positions pillar looks across the 5 sectors, defines what are all the positions and what are the leadership positions, right? So what are the ones that are important? And the final one is the power pillar. So once you're there, how much power do you have? How much formal power do you have, right? Which can be budget power, can be legislative power, veto power, can be how many people you manage. But informally, do people perceive you? Are you included in meetings, right? What influence do you have? And again, this is interesting because the index is a framework for measurement. So beyond the index, we have to analyze and look at these things. For some moment, the index at this particular time has 50 countries, which are 35 of the OECD countries, plus 15 other countries that were chosen by data availability, geography, and population. So one of the things I just like to put up front for those of you that don't sort of work in this space or don't work in the data space, despite this data revolution we're all having, is there's a lot of data out there that is simply not disaggregated by sex. So the thing that always shocked me is women in the judiciary in the United States, it's not disaggregated by sex at a national level. And so it really depends on the state or depends on a particular office. So it's quite fascinating what you will find where in a lot of government positions across the globe, it'll just have people's names, but it will not have their sex, much less their age, disability, sort of other factors that will go with that. So in order to do an index and in order to really be able to run some numbers, you have to have some data. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Before I show the index to you, I'd like to talk about sort of what are our key findings with these 50 countries to date. So the first key finding, if I can do this. Thanks, Elise, because it appears that this is not. So we had our holiday party here yesterday. So apparently they're still recovering from the talent show, which I hope that we do. I hope we taped and we'll send around. Our first key finding is that civil service is sort of the high watermark. So women comprise about 43.9% of civil service across the globe and 29.7% of leadership positions. So the gap, the 14% between those two is very short. To give you a sense of the differences, right? In the security sector, women make up only 18.2% of state-level police forces and 9.5% of militaries of NATO members, right? So the security sector is here, civil service is here. The number that we have for parliaments and Congress is about 19.4% at this point. So the civil service is doing quite well. And in a lot of countries, a place like Egypt, it is the major employer. But so this could be our high watermark, right? This could be the example of how you make this happen. Our second key finding is that there are more women and more women leaders at a local level versus a national level. So on average, women make up about 29% of regional assemblies and 27% of municipal councils. So this is a subnational sort of local level. But if you look up at national legislatures, we're talking 21% of lower houses and 23% of upper houses. There is a gap. This is important for a couple of reasons. The first is there's a lot of decision making that goes on at a local level, at a state level, at a city level, not just in the US, but globally. The second reason this is important is it's going to help us answer that question of how do we get more women into the government, right? And do people naturally sort of start at a local level and rise up to a national level or not? Are those two different sets of women? In the same way I say in other settings, not every woman is an entrepreneur. Curtis might refute that later. But where do women enter? Why do women enter? And where do they want to be? Our third finding is that, which seems intuitive, but I think will be interesting when you're talking about moving levers and really making change, is there's a statistically significant relationship between pathways and power, right? And power in the sense of what ministries are you in? We call these the glass walls. So there are glass ceilings, but there's also glass walls. Right now, women comprise about 38.4% of social cultural ministries. Those are education, health, culture. They comprise only 19.6% of basic function ministries. 18% of economy ministers are women. And 21.4% of infrastructure ministers are women, right? So women sort of get put over into what I would say the more feminized, or we call social cultural, versus sort of the basic function. So your pathways will determine what part of government you end up in. And it's interesting, just as an example, Sweden comes out, the Nordic countries, doing very well in terms of gender equality. So what does this look like at the index? Well, women's employment rate in Sweden is 69.1%. So, a lot of women employed. But they're also, they're leading 38% of the major parties. 30% of the basic function ministers are women. 30% of the economic ministers at a national and local level are women. And 67% of the infrastructure ministers are women. So there's that correlation between sort of your pathways, your employment sort of, and where you end up in government. And our final finding is that perception does matter, right? So the perceptions of women in public life will directly impact the kinds of leadership positions you will hold. So if the general public, this is based on perception surveys at this point, but if the public feels that women can hold positions or should have access to jobs and education, that will directly influence the women's rising into positions of more power. So for example, in Sweden, just to give an example of sort of what this means, right? 85% of Swedes disagree with the statement that men make better political leaders than women do. And then you see representation in Sweden. You see Margot Wallström. You see people who's a Minister of Foreign Affairs across more basic function ministries. In Slovenia, which is another country that comes out very high in terms of power and so forth, 72.8 of them disagree with the statement that men make better political leaders than women. And when you look at Slovenia, women are 30% of these basic function ministers. So the numbers are changing based on people's perceptions. And we want to go further into that, and we also want to find other factors that are influencing sort of that perception piece. And I know we'll talk about this later today on the second panel. So let's take a look at how the website works. So when you go to the website, this is the first page. So you've got the title for the index, you've got the mission statement. Our goal is called 50 by 50, so we want to ensure that by 2050, 50% of government leadership positions are held by women. So very ambitious and very long term. If we get there sooner, I would be thrilled. These are the key findings I talked about. So if you go into those, you'll find some graphs, a little bit of visualization, and some of the 4 or 5 main points. Then if you keep going down, you can get the data, as I said, and you can download all of this. You can read the methodology. You can look at what indicators are under each of these 3 pillars, what measures perception, pathways, and power. And then we have a heat map and an interactive heat map. So if you go click on Canada, as an example, it will show you sort of the index score. So how is Canada doing overall, and how is Canada doing vis-a-vis these 3 pillars? And so you'll see in Canada that the power position's very high, partially due to Trudeau appointing his cabinet and a lot of women in the cabinet. The pathways is very high in the position, so their overall score is very high. If you want to go up and look at Canada, and you can click See More Data, you go to what we call the country page. So the first thing this will tell you, which I think is interesting, is this data completeness. Coming back to sort of how much data can you actually collect in Canada. Then you can go down and look at the pathways scores, and then you can look at some scores across some key indicators. How many women in parliament, upper and lower house? What's the GDP per capita? What's the percentage of women at the labor force? You can look at the wage gap. And when you go to this data, so we don't collect the data, but we work with partners that do. So we work with the UNDP, the UN Women, the OECD, a group called Boardwalk Leadership, a group called Representation 2020. Then we'll visualize some of the key indicators for you. And so, Canada has a high mark. Women make up 55% of civil service employees in Canada. And they're at 46.4% of leadership positions in civil service. So not only just at the minister level, but in the civil service level, they're getting close to that parity that we'd like to see. And they're 50% of the basic function ministers. They're 71% of the social cultural, 44% of the economic ministries, but they're still only 15% of the armed forces. So just to give you a sense, so you can go and find some key facts, you can see some visualizations. We will go look now at another country, just to show you another example of Kenya. And so Kenya is interesting. So again, you can see Kenya's index score right here. You can see that on the pathway score, they're very, very high, but very low on the position score. Despite an actual quota actually calling for 30%, women do not comprise 30% of the ballots nor 30% of parliament, even though there is a quota in place. So the question becomes, it's just a lack of political will, is what the ambassador of Kenya was talking about a little while earlier. But you can look at this intersection. If we go up to the Kenya country page, then you can again look at these scores, and you can see these key indicators. And what's interesting is, again, sticking with our civil service is the high watermark, Women make up about 36% of civil service employees and 28% of the leadership positions. So that gap between their participation in the civil service and their leadership is not very high. So it's great. We talked a bit about the quota and looking at Parliament, how that doesn't intersect. So the question becomes, from an analysis standpoint, why? What's holding that back, right? In Kenya, we talked about this indicator earlier, just as an interesting fact, it takes 22 days for women to start a business in Kenya. So this is telling you what some of these pathways indicators look like and what that can tell you about women's access to both careers and workforce, right? And in Kenya, just going back to that glass walls argument, 25% of economic ministers are women. So that's a pretty good, getting closer from that glass walls, getting, out of social culture ministries and into more of the basic function ministries. So Kenya's an interesting example of trying to look at these things. And again, we visualize some of the data, so you can look at what some of this looks like on the website, and you can make it accessible. So I really look forward to a rich discussion today. The next two panels will be people that have worked in this space, people that we consider the key stakeholders and audiences, right? Going back to my opening remarks, we want governments to use this, we want the private sector to use this, we want political parties to use this, we want the people that could change the policies to be able to use this, and to use this framework to provide the analysis. So right now, I'm going to call up Liz Gray, who is the Chief Mindset Officer, if I have the title correct, for the Female Quotient, which is a parent company that runs the Girls Lounge, which brings together women business leaders and women leaders across a wide variety of events, and publishes the Modern Guide to Equality twice a year, which will tell you by sector sort of how we're doing in terms of women equality. And I will call up Liz and the first panel to, Jane, do you want to make a few comments? No? Sorry, I'm just going to. This is Jane Harman, who, by the way, is the President, Director, and CEO of the Wilson Center. She's the first woman to head this Wilson Center. She's also one of the women we're talking about. She spent 18 years in Congress and is a leader in national security.
Well, thank you, Gwen. Hi, everyone. The Movable Feast. The Wilson Center has, 3 simultaneous activities, and I couldn't calibrate exactly how to do it, but we women can do everything. And here I am. I just wanted to say a couple of things. First of all, why did it take so long to have this? Shouldn't we have had it a long time ago? I was elected to Congress in 1992, the year some of you were born, I think. I can't see that well. But it was called the Year of the Woman, imagine. The Year of the Woman. Why? Because the number of women in Congress doubled in the House. And California elected 2 women senators, Boxer and Feinstein. Feinstein's still there, and now it has another woman senator. So, this was the great oddity. Women didn't share committees, women didn't do this, women didn't do that. Now we do. But the conversation about women in government, certainly even ours, is so episodic. And it took this long for the Wilson Center to develop an index which is factual. Instead of, telling stories, instead of the XYZ network version and the ABC network version. And ABC was not intended to be a real network. But instead of that, we have the facts on the ground. And what I love about this is it's going to grow from 50, where it is now, I think, it's still, to 195 by April, when we will roll it out in its full glory. Meanwhile, we have this launch, we have something, or with others of you, we think, in Davos, and then we will have the April extravaganza. So I just want to say this matters. Oh, what did I do? This matters a lot to me as a woman in public service, and it matters a lot to me as the leader of a think tank which didn't have a women's platform when I got here. And it matters a lot to all of you, and we're very pleased that Gwen is directing the work here. She brings enormous experience, and we're staying in this lane. When you think women's index, you need to think this index, and the Wilson Center, along with all of our friends. So thank you for coming, and apologies for inserting myself at the wrong point in the program, but hey, we're doing the Middle East over there. We did a little North Korean nukes over here, and I'm glad I'm here. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you. I'm so thrilled to be here again. My name is Liz Gray. I am with the Female Quotient. We are in the business of equality, and I'm thrilled to be part of this conversation because I am a firm believer that it is the combination of data and powerful storytelling that really will advance change. And I think we're going to have two conversations today, one talking about the data and the other really talking about the compelling storytelling. And we've put together a diverse group of perspectives that I think is only going to add to the conversation. So this first panel, I'm going to introduce them and then let them give a little more background on their roles today. But where we're really going to dive in, and I think the beauty of this tool is really that it's going to enable us to walk the talk. I think we've all been talking about a lot of these important issues for a very long time, and why it's important to be measuring and have the data is not only does it allow us to look at where we are, but it allows us to figure out where we need to be. It creates accountability, and it gives us the data that we need to create tangible programs and policies. So that's what we're going to talk about first this morning. The group I have beside me is Roz Brooks, who's the Managing Director, Government Regulatory Affairs and Public Policy at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Next to her is Curtis Etherly, Director of Diplomatic Relations for Coca-Cola. Dr. Katherine Fritz is the Director of the ICRW Advisors for the International Center for Research on Women. And lastly, Jennifer Windsor, who's the Practice Lead Senior Director of Gender and Social Inclusion at MCC, which is the Millennial Challenge Corporation. So an amazing group of individuals. Thank you for joining me. I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves and the role that you play every day. And I'd also like to tag on to that what you're most excited about for 2018. And that doesn't have to be anything, don't overthink it. It could be the fact that feminism is the word that they've chosen for the year. No, but it could just be, anything. We were going to do a New Year's resolution, but there's so much judgment and pressure that comes with that. So just tell us what you're excited about. So I'll start with you, Roz.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Again, like Liz said, I'm Roz Brooks. I'm with PwC, which is a professional services firm, for those of you who don't know, rooted in public company auditing, so basically accounting, tax, and consulting services. I lead our Washington office, so run government affairs for PwC. I like to tell my parents and their friends I lobby for the firm. After the last election, after President Obama talked about lobbyists in the manner in which he did, my parents were a little concerned about my chosen profession, but I assured them that I am on the good side of lobbying in DC, if for those of you who believe there is one. So that's my day-to-day responsibility in that role. I also serve as the PwC Political Action Committee Treasurer, and I'm on the board of the PAC, which is the partners kind of collectively putting their money together to elect and support candidates for a federal election. And in that role, there has been tremendous interest from my standpoint in kind of this index, because part of what the journey we've been on as PwC and kind of gender equality and looking for gender parity is also looking at kind of the role in the policy setting and politics and how you can support women candidates and women running for office. So I'm very delighted to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Curtis Etherly with the Coca-Cola Company. It is such a pleasure and honor to be here today. I always like to start with, I'm a bit of a storyteller. We at Coca-Cola tell a lot of stories, so it's probably not that unusual. But I'm a native Washingtonian, and my mother was from Birmingham, Alabama. And I'm just throwing out Birmingham, Alabama, because of course we had some wonderful things. This is a nonpartisan conversation today, but Birmingham, Alabama. There you go. I shall leave it at that.
That's right.
Yay, Curtis.
I cover diplomatic affairs and domestic portfolio in our DC office here. So similar to Roz, I can indeed be assigned that nom de plume of lobbyist, so to speak. I'll simply leave my prefatory remarks to this. Well, why is Koch up here? You know, why are we up here? You know, aside from perhaps being the token guy on the panel, and why, Gwen, you put me in the center here. I'm going to find that a little discordant to have the man in the center. But I assured the panel as we were preparing earlier that I'm not going to mansplain anything, and I would encourage the audience that if I do fall into mansplaining, please slap me very quickly. But in all seriousness, why is this important for us? Why are we talking about it at Coca-Cola? I cover the African continent, Middle East, and Central Asia. So I cover some fascinating territory. I'm so honored and pleased to say that at Koch, when we look at our business, when we look at the success of that business, women are integral to it. They're integral in a number of ways. They're integral as consumers, purchasers of our product. It is perhaps no surprise to many of you that it is women who chiefly make the purchase decisions, whether you're looking at the U.S. context or whether you're looking outside of the U.S. marketplace. Women are making the purchase decisions. Small businesses constitute the vast bulk of the work that we do. So where you tend to buy your product, more often than not, certainly here in the U.S., you'll go to a big grocery store, as you may in Europe or as you may in Asia or Africa. But chances are you're probably more often than not going to a small business, and that small business is owned by a woman. So our consumers and our customers are women. If we're going to be successful for another 130 plus years, we have to ensure that we stay mindful of that equation and that we do all we can to encourage the robustness and the health of that equation. So you'll hear me speak quite a bit today about our 5x20 program, which is a commitment to empower 5 million women economically by the year 2020. We have just about 2 years to go. We're at about 1.7, 1.8 million women empowered economically. That's in terms of entrepreneurship. That's in terms of not only serving as Coca-Cola retailers, but also serving as suppliers, helping with the inputs that go into the Coca-Cola production process. Artisans, what do women artisans do in terms of their creative work with the product after its life cycle has run its course, turning this bottle into jewelry, turning our packaging into other pieces of art or purses or bags, shirts, you name it. So you're going to hear us talk quite a bit about that from that perspective, and I hope that helps to ground your thinking in the point of, well, what does the private sector have to do with this? Why is this so important? I can't say kudos enough to you, Gwen, of course to Jane, who was here with us earlier. Let me thank Elise for all of her support in pulling this together. But data matters. We can tell you soup to nuts, not only where this bottle was made, what time it was made, we can tell you where it was sold, and we can go back years and tell you what that zip code sold in 1972 or 2010. Data drives so much of what we do. And this kind of tool can help inform how we make decisions about the philanthropic aspect of our work to support this mission, as well as to continue to help grow our business. So hopefully that gets you a little grounded. Again, if I mansplain at any point during the day, please slap me on my wrist. Thank you. Thank you. Looking forward to our conversation.
Great. And I'm Katherine Fritz, and I work for the International Center for Research on Women. And we are an applied research institute, and for 42 years we've been building the evidence base on what works to empower women and girls, mostly in low and middle income countries. And we have always had a strong emphasis as well on women's leadership and investigating that. As part of ICRW, I lead ICRW Advisors, which is our consulting practice that aims to help companies like Coca-Cola sharpen up their approaches to achieving gender equity, both within how they expand their women's leadership possibilities, but also throughout their whole value chain. So for all the same reasons that Curtis just mentioned, Private sector is this incredible engine for promoting gender equity, and we see more and more companies getting involved. So I work on that issue.
That's great. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Windsor from the Millennium Challenge Corporation. For those of you that don't know the Millennium Challenge Corporation, it was established over a decade ago. It's a different approach to development than that undertaken by some more traditional development agencies, especially USAID, which is I'm also an alum of. MCC really uses data in everything that we do. So we're very selective about the countries we invest in. They have to pass certain selection criteria. Many of those criteria involve women in many ways. And we have a particular, something called the Gender in the Economy Indicator, which really looks at what are the legal barriers to women being able to fully participate in the economy. We also use data in terms of analyzing what the key constraints to economic growth are. And we use data throughout in terms of designing our programs and monitoring it and evaluating them. So it's a very much of a learning organization. We work in very close partnership with countries. So we design the programs with local representatives on the ground, and they're responsible for implementing the program. And really almost since the inception, MCC has committed itself to integrating gender into everything that we do. Now, that's not always easy because a lot of the work that we do involves infrastructure and work in more non-traditional sectors, such as energy or water supply, roads, transportation. So, but even in that, we can talk about this. Women and the role of women can be highlighted both as consumers and beneficiaries, but also how can they help make sure the projects are more successful. So I'm the head of the Gender and Social Inclusion team, so we really look at, and I can talk about this, who is not being included in the current system and what can we do through our projects to be able to maximize that impact.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all. I know you all chose not to answer my 2018 question, but we won't.
Oh my goodness.
I'm sure we're all excited about something. But Jennifer, just to follow up to that, I would love to hear a little bit more about how you're using data to make sure that programs and policies are inclusive, and maybe even talk a little bit about how you're defining inclusive, because that can be a huge challenge and barrier.
Yeah, so I mean, I think what I loved about this index, many things. One of, since my background is that I also ran Freedom House, so I'm a very, very big believer in the power of indices and regular collection of data and presentation of it, because we need that. So, you know, what's really important for us is we do a lot of analysis up front about what's going on in the country. And in the end, we have to think about every country, including our own, is about who's got the power and who doesn't. So without looking and tackling that issue, you can't figure out how to deal with those groups that are more disadvantaged than others. So, so we help to basically analyze what's going on in this country in terms of who is benefiting from current growth and who is not. And in pretty much all cases, women, but also youth, maybe the poorer segments of society, they are not necessarily reaping the full benefits. And part of what MCC is about is trying to achieve poverty reduction through economic growth. In order for that to happen, you need to think about making that growth more inclusive. So we really analyze what are the legal barriers, what are the non-legal barriers, but still sort of rules, culture, behavior patterns, women's participation in the labor force, all the different barriers that can prevent women from fully benefiting from our program. So to me, inclusive growth is about making sure that the benefits of that growth do not go only to those at the top half of society. Because in the end, for growth to be sustainable and to truly benefit the population of a country, you need to employ specific methodologies to be able to include and to reach those that have been excluded or disadvantaged, including and especially women.
Okay, great. Thank you. Curtis, I want to go back to you for a second, because it brings up all of your introductions have brought up some interesting points about who should be leading the effort in gender parity in both the public and the private sector. And would love your thoughts on that, especially as it relates to inclusive leadership and leveraging data to make sure that we're advancing.
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. I would say that oftentimes you're going to hear business, you hear the private sector talk about enabling environment. And in many respects, it's often talked about in terms of what are the right set of policies to encourage business, to encourage investment, to encourage activity. I'll take that term and apply it very much here because I think the role for the private sector is certainly as a part of creating that enabling environment. When you hear our chairman, Muhtar Kent, or our CEO, James Quincy, talk about partnerships, you oftentimes hear the term, and it's not something that we've coined, we haven't trademarked it yet, the Golden Triangle. And that's simply, it's private sector, it's civil society, it's government. And so from our perspective, doing this work and doing all of the various related parts of this work, because I trust we all recognize this is just one part of a large continuum. We shouldn't be looking at gender parity, women in leadership in a vacuum and look at it exclusive or distinct from other aspects of the inquiry, because as you've heard many allude to, there are political aspects to this conversation. There are legal, there are social and other policy aspects to this, and it all becomes part of the same inquiry. But for us, we find it incredibly important to, when we sit at the table, that we talk about this in a partnership way. It can't be the private sector alone. It's extraordinarily exciting to be able to say that we're at the table with MCC. We recently signed an MOU with MCC to leverage our shared expertise to take advantage of the work that they do, the experience that they bring to the table around indicators and all of their work in country with the work that we're doing, not only in the 5x20 space, but in the water and environmental sustainability space. We've partnered with PwC on their CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion. Their CEO has helped, Mr. Ryan has helped to lead a tremendous conversation about diversity and inclusion in the wake of a lot of police-related violence that we've seen here in the U.S. But he recognizes, as does the CEO Action Task Force, that gender is a part of this conversation, is a part of the inclusivity piece. So it's a long-winded way of saying, oftentimes, just the very fact that the private sector will sit at the table with government leaders and talk about women and talk about what we're doing to grow the entrepreneurial workforce around women, around youth, the fact that we're talking about education in Nigeria with leaders, that brings a great deal of gravitas to the table that can't be understated. So I think that's a critical piece of one aspect of the role that the private sector can play.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this idea of the power of collaboration and looking at the problem holistically, which the index does, is crucial. Katherine, I'd love to hear from you about how data can be informing the important work around policies and programs to advancing change.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm a professional researcher, so data is what, we live and breathe at ICRW, so we're constantly pushing for more and more. I think just, one issue that I wanted to bring up quickly, because I think it's just to touch on Curtis's and also your presence here in the private sector, is that this question of leadership, I feel like in many ways we're having two separate conversations often about leadership, one about the public sector and one about the private sector. But these are really the same conversation. And I was just reflecting this morning on the train ride here about the extent to which the barrier between public leadership and private leadership has become so permeable now. And thinking, in fact, about if we actually had parity in the C-suite, for example, gender parity in the C-suite, we would also have the opportunity to have many more, the Secretary of State, for example, or the Secretary of the Treasury could possibly be a woman right now instead of a man. So I think that these are the ways that, the pathway to power in government is not just through civil service. It's also private sector leaders being plucked and called on to come in and lead the country. So I think that the barriers to getting to those leadership positions are the same, whether you're in a company or you're in the government. So that was just something that I wanted to kind of put out there. But in terms of data, I think there are 3 types of data that we need. One describes the magnitude of the gender gaps. The second describes what causes these gaps, and the third investigates what works to close the gaps. So I think we're farthest along with data on the magnitude of the gender gaps. We have a lot of fantastic data coming out both from the private and the public sector on this, and that's incredibly important because it's motivating. And these kind of factoids that can be, quickly bounced around are incredibly useful. One of my favorite factoids comes from a recent McKinsey report that came out on women in the workplace, which said that if women were promoted in the workplace at the same rate as men, there would right now be 2 to 3 times as many women in the C-suite. So, that's, helpful. And then data in terms of what causes the gaps, and I think the index also speaks to this. I mean, there are lots of things we could talk about, but just on the top of my mind right now is the Me Too movement. I think this whole introspection and interrogation of what hostile working environments are doing to women and how it's keeping them out of the leadership pipeline is incredibly important. We need to understand that much, much more. We don't have data. We have stories right now, which are great, but we need more data on exactly how that is detracting from the leadership pipeline for women, both in government and in the public sector, as we've found out clearly that government can also be a hostile working environment. And then finally, what works? I think this is the area that's least developed right now. We don't have a lot of data on what works. There's some experimentation going on, and there's some natural experiments that are ripe for study that we're currently missing out on. So I think that there's a tremendous need for more investment in gathering the data that would help us understand that.
That's great. And I do think that the index is really going to enable us to have that benchmark so that we can see what's working. Roz, I'd love to hear from you, from your perspective, on what gaps still remain within the knowledge base in terms of what we need to know to drive gender parity.
Well, I think to what Katherine was saying in terms of we've got a lot of information, as you say, about the magnitude of what exists. I think when you look at kind of a lot of the data out there, I thought what was really interesting was both the point that Curtis and Jennifer and Katherine actually all made about the notion of public perception and what the index kind of follows in terms of how public perception enables kind of the pathway, if you think about it, or the power as you think about women in these positions. And something that Curtis said is you talked about collaboration and kind of the notion that whether it's enabling things in the C-suite, enabling things in public sector, it's all coming about the cultural kind of public perception of how you view women in that space and how you get there, right? And so I think having more kind of, I think this index, which really fascinating about it, is following those 3 pillars of being able to provide more of the relation between kind of as Katherine said, we talk about kind of we know the magnitude of the problem, we kind of know that there are causes to it, and then kind of what do you do? At this point now, it's like, what do you do to really make a difference? And I think having an index that can give you the interrelation between different things is, it's not a ranking, right? So it's the interrelation between the different, and in this case, the 3 Ps, so the interrelation between the different pillars so that you can look at kind of outcomes that exist and see, okay, well, what levers were working in those situations? So what it could be policies around, whether it's, paid leave or enabling functions, if you will, to allow women to participate, or maybe there is a cultural kind of difference, and you look at kind of whether that's, both from the public and private sector partnership of increasing the awareness and the ability of women to participate so that pretty soon it's just normal, right? It just becomes what people are thinking about. That's kind of some of the stuff that comes to mind, yeah.
I agree, and actually one of the questions I was going to ask, but I feel like we've all touched on it, was what is the biggest barrier right now? So I'd love to hear from all of you on what you think is the single policy that could happen right now that would have the biggest impact.
I'm happy to jump in because I want
Yeah.
to riff a little bit off of Roz's comments, and then I'm going to come to the 2018 piece that
Yeah.
you asked, because oh my goodness, I
know.
did
No
forget about
one's-
that. You know, for us, you know, I can't help but think of the old adage that many of you have probably heard, the old saying that, you know, trust God, for all others bring data. I mean, and this is perhaps the most fundamental iteration of that, so to speak. But something that Gwen walked us through when she shared the index on the screen is very important here, and that is how this index will help us all understand power, you know, pathways, position, as you heard her speak to, but it takes us from this one or this two-dimensional kind of framework that perhaps we think of. When we think of power, perhaps we think fundamentally of who's at the head of state. And the index helps to show that there are a lot of different ways to get from point A to point B. There are a lot of different point Bs to which a woman or to which any leader may aspire. And then there are varying levels of effectiveness once you get to that place. And the fact that you have these various silos such that you may likely see a woman in the social space in the civil service as opposed to the economic space or as opposed to the military space, helping us understand that there's this 3D construct that you need to think about, multiple dimensions, maybe not even 3, but multiple dimensions. When we look at the data around our 5x20 work, we're not only looking at, okay, the woman entrepreneur who came to us with a dream and a notion now is running a business. We're also looking at what does she do with her income? What does she do with what that business creates? And that helps to really give you a much more nuanced understanding that you can then take to policymakers. Because what do we find? No surprise probably to many of you here in the room. She is more likely to put that into savings. She is more likely to put that back into her family for medical and educational costs. She is more likely to put that towards medical costs for herself. So this exponential impact, because of the data that we see, then helps us make better decisions about where to redouble our efforts and where to further concentrate resources. So that's something that I think is real critical here, again, about how effective and impactful this tool is going to be. And I'm emphasizing tool, not some static index that should just sit on a website, but a tool that can be used. The 2018 question for us is we're going through a refranchising process. And why do I raise that and what does that mean? Coca-Cola, for many of you, it's a brand. You know it, you probably know it as a company out of Atlanta, but it's a franchise-based system, meaning that the product is brought to you by tons of different companies that all don't fall under the rubric of the Coca-Cola company based in Atlanta. Your local bottler in this region is based in Charlotte, North Carolina, for an example. But it's all Coca-Cola to you. Why does that matter? Refranchising is going to create even more of an opportunity for very localized and very tailored work around women's engagement, women's empowerment, pay parity, pay equity. It's going to raise more challenges because it's a much more diffuse system. But the fact that we have more of these franchises out here and even globally will create even more opportunities for women in leadership roles. We still have some work to do there. Board representation, leadership roles, C-suite role. But this work has a tremendous amount of utility and potential for helping us to do a better job as we go through refranchising. So that's a big opportunity for us in 2018. Again, to you, no changes to the brand. It's still that red contour bottle and all the other products that you know. But in terms of refranchising, for us, it is a fundamental sea change in how we do business and what it means globally.
Great, thank you. Catherine, what about you? What do you think the biggest policy change right now?
Policy change, you know, I'll go with mandatory paternity leave. You know, I think there's so many things around reducing the burden of unpaid care work for women that it's ripe for so many policy changes, both from the government, but as well from the private sector. This is, you know, clearly we know for a fact it's a barrier to women rising in leadership. And there's so many innovative approaches to solving the problem. It's not rocket science to solve these issues. It does require some social norm change, but often social norm change can be triggered by policy changes. And I think that mandatory paternity leave would be one of those that, 50 years ago, if we looked back on that one change, that we could see all the downstream effects that would be so just fundamentally, important.
I agree, and it ties back to this idea of perception and really disrupting social norms.
So I'm going to use an example from Liberia because it's pretty hard to say one policy that would help every country. In Liberia, you have had a president who's a woman, first African woman president. You had a commitment to increase the influence of women there. You've got a strong Ministry of Gender, Children and Social Protection. But what we have found as we've implemented programs there, that translating that into ministries like, for instance, those that relate to electricity generation, or the Ministry of Department of Energy and the ministry or the utility company, in terms of making sure that there's gender balance in leadership and in employment, that they think about the needs of women and other groups when they're designing what kind of electricity programs they're going to be presenting. You can see that it needs a lot more than policy support from the top. You need to be able to put data, collect data as to what kind of gender representation is in there, which we've done, and where they could be, why they should get there, and then give them the tools to use that data and open up the system so that civil society actors can see how they're doing against what the benchmark is and hold the government accountable for saying, listen, you said this, but you're not actually reflecting it in your what you do. So my best 2018 success is we're going to be doing a workshop in Accra, Ghana, specifically looking at how do we look at energy issues in a gender inclusive and socially inclusive way. And we're going to try to bring together all of our MCC and MCAs, those are our local counterparts, that have energy compacts, and also some of the utilities and others that we're working with. And we're going to review what we know to date as to what has worked and what some of the key issues are we need to move forward in a very non-traditional area, which is energy, but where women belong just as much as they belong anywhere else.
That's great. Thank you.
So I'll be quick. I know we have to get to our other panel. I struggle with the question about the one policy thing. This is kind of where like policy and politics is where I spend a lot of my time. And I don't know that there's one thing. I really do like that notion of kind of mandatory paternity leave, because that is about changing perception, right?
Yes.
That's about you also will be absent from the workplace whether you want to or not for a period of time, and you must deal with, it doesn't become a stigma in terms of, I really do like that. So I'm going to go with Katherine. I'm going to piggyback on Katherine.
There's no shame in that.
No shame at all. 2018, I am most looking forward to what we as a collective nation do in 2018, given the turmoil of 2017. I think out of 2017, I am anxious to see all of the great things that can come from 2018. Curtis mentioned the CEO Action and Diversity that was born out of turmoil that happened in 2017. That was just so I'm really excited for what 2018 can bring for us as a country.
All right, well, thank you all. This was a great conversation. I'm going to welcome the second panel to the stage. And then we're going to have Q&A for all of the panelists at the very end. All right. Thank you, guys. So I'm going to introduce, so our next panel, as I briefly talked about before, is Data innovating social change. So this idea of data coming together with powerful storytelling to advance change. We have an incredible panel. Allison Capon is the co-founder of RAD Campaign and founder of Women Who Tech. Kate McCarthy is the director of programs for the Women Media Center. And lastly, Jay Newton-Small is the Time contributor and author of Broad Influence, How Women Are Changing the Way Washington Works.
America Works.
Oh, I'm sorry, America Works. I didn't put back on my glasses. I apologize. But thank you all for joining me today. Again, I'd love for you to introduce yourselves. I know that your titles are just one thing on a page, and just bring a little color to what you all do. I won't even ask you guys the 2018 question because it fell flat before, and it's kind of a heavy topic this morning. So you go ahead.
Okay, I'm Allison Capon. I am the founder of the web agency RAD Campaign. We're based here in DC, and we provide web development and apps for nonprofit organizations. And I'm also the founder of a volunteer-run nonprofit called Women Who Tech and the Women's Startup Challenge. And our goal is to help fund and showcase women-led startups. Right now, only 7% of investor money goes to women-led startups. For women of color, the stats are even more dismal. About 0.2% of venture funding goes to startups by women of color. So what we're really trying to do is to disrupt a culture and economy that's made it exceedingly difficult for women to raise capital. And I'm very excited to report that some of the impact that we have had over the last couple of years is that the women that have come through our cohorts have collectively raised over $20 million. So we're definitely seeing little bits of impact there. And in terms of 2018, I'm just going to answer your question. My ultimate goal is to help fund women-led startups, because I believe that it is these women who are going to have major innovations and impact on this world. And from a personal perspective, I'm also looking at what kind of products that we can build to truly build political power at the local level so that we do not repeat 2016 again.
Perfect. Okay, what about you?
Thank you. So I work for the Women's Media Center, and the Women's Media Center, we put our efforts into making women and girls more visible and powerful in media. As Gloria Steinem, who is one of our co-founders, said, you can't be it if you can't see it. So if we don't see ourselves in the media, it's much more likely that we are going to work to be the doctor, the business leader, the politician that we see on that we could otherwise be. So the Women's Media Center does a variety of different things. We do an awful lot of research. We have a research hub that's looking at the status of women in media. We produce numerous reports every year trying to put a benchmark in place, as we've been talking about, for women in media. We do a lot of original content. We try to model what content would look like if women's stories and women's voices were at the center of it, rather as they often are now, as a secondary thought. And we have programs that are trying to help journalists be better at including more women's voices and more women's stories in the media. We have a program called She Source, where we have 1,300 women who we connect up with journalists on a daily basis. So journalists looking for sources, and we're always looking to recruit women experts to that. So if you visit shesource.org, you will find the application form online. Please do share it amongst your networks. And we do training. So we train women leaders to be media ready and media savvy. So that's in essence what we do. And for my 2018, because I was thinking about it, what I would
the storytellers.
What I would really love to see is I'd love to see the Me Too movement move away from the stories of individual women or even groups of women, and it to be taken up by employers and businesses and public sector and private sector organizations who could take on the responsibility of changing the culture so that women no longer have to deal with what we're finding out is happening. And every woman in this room and every woman I know happens on a daily and weekly basis. So that's my dream for 2018.
That sounds like a good one. I'm in. Jay, what about you?
So I wear two hats. I am, first of all, founder of Memory Well, which is a startup. So I want to talk to you after this.
Definitely.
We're doing a seed round of fundraising right now, which grabbed my experience with my dad who had Alzheimer's. And so it's a platform of more than 400 journalists across the country. And we write the life stories of seniors entering care, replacing those clunky questionnaires that really nobody loves to fill out and nobody ever reads, with professionally told stories, and then that are digitized. And we have a website where families can then build a whole timeline and upload their loved ones' favorite music and arts and videos and readings, so that whomever's sitting with them, whether it's a paid caregiver or a grandchild, has a whole toolbox of things with which to engage them. What brings me here today is I am author of Broad Influence, which How Women Are Changing the Way America Works, which is a book that I wrote. It came out in January of 2016, and it grew out of out of a Time magazine article I wrote in 2013 about the women of the Senate coming together during the government shutdown to restart the negotiations to reopen the government when none of the men would talk to each other. And what interested me most about that episode was that it was the first time women had reached 20% of the Senate. And as someone who'd covered the Senate on and off for the better part of a dozen years, you could really tangibly feel the impact that those women made. They chaired or ranked on 11 of the 20 committees, and they ended up producing more than 75% of the legislation that was passed into law in that 2-year session. So they had a huge impact. So my book looks at critical mass. What happens when women reach somewhere between 20 and 30% in any body, whether it's a legislature like the Senate or a corporate board, a Navy ship, or an appellate court, and how that's a tipping point, and women begin to change the way things are done. And I wrote a story, and I still have a bi-monthly column for Time, and I wrote a column last month about how we're looking at this tipping point right now in media and in Hollywood, because one of the first things that changes when we reach this tipping point is that there are enough women around that we can gather together and support each other and say, no, the casting couch culture is no longer acceptable. It's no longer acceptable that part of our job descriptions is to be sexually harassed and groped. And you've seen that, I think, in recent months in the media, which has been really great. I would like to just note, and I think this sort of leads to 2018, that just now, about an hour ago, the governor of Minnesota named Tina Smith to replace Al Franken in the Senate, which brings the number of women in the Senate up to 22%, an all-time high.
The index just
And the number of women overall in Congress to 106 out of 535 members, which is 19.8%. So if we elect just one more woman to Congress, 107 out of 535, that gets us to finally breaking the 20% threshold overall in Congress, which is, I think, a worthy goal, just one more woman. But why not elect maybe just 28 more women in the next election, and that will get us to 25%. So I think that's a nice goal to think of in 2018, and with the more than 20,000 women that are running for office.
That's great. Thank you. So I love this conversation about how media and tech can really leverage the way that the data and the stories are being told. And Allison, I'd love to hear from you about the numbers on women leaderships. What are the stories that they're telling, and how can tech right now amplify that?
Yeah. So right now, I think we have something called the 7% story. So we're seeing 7% of investor money going to women-led startups. We are seeing only 7% of partners at the top 100 VC firms. And then we're only seeing about 7% of the business and tech press writing about women entrepreneurs. And I think those numbers are really problematic because it really shows the negative effects of what is happening when women don't have equal access to capital. So here's what happens. Our startups don't get funded, which impacts innovation throughout the world, which impacts women's wealth, which then impacts how many women become investors who tend to very much support other women-led startup founders. And then that trickles down to the press, where women entrepreneurs are just completely left out of media coverage. So investing in women entrepreneurs, to me, and to many others on this panel, this is not about charity. It's not about some social justice issue. It's actually good for business, and there are several studies that prove this. So women-led tech startups, they generate 35% higher ROI, and they generate 25% higher revenue than just tech startups exclusively run by men. And women-owned businesses, particularly in the US, they're growing at 5 times the national average, and we are seeing some similar numbers internationally as well. So I think those are some of the key stats and the key stories that need to be told, is that these aren't just statistics. It's trickling down into every area of our life: politics, the economy, our personal wealth. So it's a huge story that just needs to be told. And I don't see the media, when they're covering this, they may cover some of these statistics, but they're not weaving all of this together to show like the massive impact that it's having.
Kate, what do you think? How do you think that an evidence-based storyline can help advance change and leveraging the knowledge that Allison just shared?
I think until you know the numbers, you don't know where you're starting and you don't know where you want to go. So I think for whatever business it is, whatever sector it is, I think doing the count, doing the audit, finding out what the data is. So then you can make a decision about how you want to change that. And incidentally, if you decide you do want to change it, you need to make sure, in the same way as a business will have rewards for those people who make a certain number of sales, the same sort of reward system or recognition system should be in place for people who are actually getting parity in the number of people they employ who are women or people of colour, particularly in this setting. So I think the numbers are crucially important to change it, and the media has a role to amplify and explain those numbers to the readership. But to me, almost more important is the next step. So you've got the numbers, so we know that 68% of the bylines and the people telling the news are male and 32%, whatever it is, are female. But how does that impact the story that's being told? Yeah. And one of the pieces of research that we've done 2 pieces of research, one on rape and the coverage of campus rape, and the other on the coverage of reproductive health issues. Both of those issues are issues that particularly pertain to women. In both of those issues, women tell many fewer of the stories than men do. So I think it's 35 and 32% of the journalists telling those stories were women. But more interestingly, if you then analyze who the journalists are quoting in their stories, women tend to turn to women more as sources in their stories than men do, and men tend to turn to men. Yeah. In both of those settings, more men were quoted than women, but the women quoted almost as many women as they did men. And the women talked about issues in a different way. So for reproductive rights or the reproductive health coverage, for example, women talked about it as a health issue. Men talked about it as a legislative issue. So in this time when politics, often reproductive health and abortion, is a really big issue within a political setting and it can determine who people vote for, it has become a political issue rather than a health issue because the men are being quoted, because the men are the journalists writing the story. So to me, it's that nugget that is the bit that we have to look at next. So what difference do the numbers make, as well as just knowing the numbers?
And Jay, how important do you think it is for the media to make a conscious and active decision to play a role in shaping perception?
I don't know that the media makes conscious and active decisions on anything.
I know. And so, and I would love to hear your thoughts on how we can make that happen. What needs to happen to do that?
So I guess I would say the numbers, the data is really important, and it doesn't really exist. So when I wrote my book, for example, I wanted to know how many women were sort of in the management level of the government. And so you would think that would be a really easy question to ask, right? And so I went to the Department of Labor and I was like, how many women are in management levels in the government? And they were like, oh, there's a whole women's bureau in the Department of Labor. I was like, that's great. There's a women's bureau. So I went to the women's bureau and they were like, yeah, we have no idea. And then they were like, I was like, well, what can you tell me? And they were like, well, in like 1998, IBM was like 17% women. And I was like, how is that helpful? And they were like, yeah, well, everything that we have is voluntarily reported, so we don't really have anything. And it took me talking to all 15 branches of the government for labor unions and the White House to figure out that the upper level civil service and political appointees were about 30% in 2015, the time I was writing my book. So we have tons of aggregate data, right? Like, McKinsey, PricewaterhouseCoopers, I mean, they all do these studies that tell us that there's like 17% of traders in America are women on the trading floor, or like, 20-something percent, 21, 22% of like, coders are women. Maybe not even, I have no idea. And so, but nobody ever tells us the exact numbers, right? Because it's all reported anonymously with the assurance that we're, I will give you our numbers so you can do an aggregate, but no one's ever going to tell the exact numbers. So we really don't know how many people these companies actually employ in terms of their women C-suite, their presence in the C-suites. We know they're board members because they have to publicly announce those, but and so I think just getting to those numbers is really important. I don't know that it's going to come from media, the solution, frankly. And I don't know that media is in much of a position to collect a lot of that information. Mm-hmm. And so I personally think that what would be super helpful here, and I've had so many women ask me around the country, like, how can I help? What can I do? There's like all this stuff going on. If we could create some sort of like wiki where women can anonymously report like on every level, and you can see how many women in each company was reporting these things and how many women in each, like, just walk around your neighborhood and say, like, for example, police forces. Mm-hmm. We have no idea how many women are on police forces across the United States. The last women's association that collected numbers on police forces went defunct 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. So we have no sense whatsoever of like, and there's no training programs for women nationally to get more women into police at a time when they would make a huge difference, right? Like at a time of like Ferguson and riots in Baltimore, when women are the last people on the planet to use excessive force and to use their fists as a solution in terms of enforcement, and studies show that over and over again. I think that the solution has to come from an open data crowdsourced one, and nothing like that exists right now. And being able to just sort of create a safe place where women can anonymously or put their name to it, report not only how many people are in their companies, how many people are in their police forces or their local boards or whatever it is, but also like how much money they make. Mm-hmm. That would be an enormous game changer for us, and I think that that's the only way to do it.
Yeah, I think that technology could play a huge role in the transparency piece.
I was just going to say, I just want to go back to a couple of things that you both said. I think it was a really interesting example that you said that the women reporters were going to women's sources, and I've had like mixed reviews on the tech side, and that the men were going to men because that's who is in their network, and that's frankly how we see it in the startup world. Men fund men who look like them. It's called the meritocracy. So I'm curious, do you see a role in media organizations like putting out mandates to reporters that they need to be able to diversify their sources? Because in the startup world, it's not like there aren't thousands of women-led startups. There are, and then in every other sector, the same thing. There are many women leaders, yes, maybe not as many as men, but should there be some sort of mandate by the Washington Post, by the New York Times, that when they're doing these stories, that the sources have to be diversified?
It's a great question. I mean, there's been a lot of organizations around for years that have shamed them into it, right? So there's Gender Avenger, Gina Glanz's group, that will sort of point out, like, all the man panels on cable, like they just, one after the next one. And it's especially egregious when you're talking about like women's issues, right? Yeah. It's like the women's vote, here are 4 white men, and you're like, it's really useful.
So great to get their perspective.
Yeah, exactly. They were wondering what they were thinking.
But it's, I think that those kinds of quotas are very controversial, and it's hard to imagine newsrooms doing that. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. I don't, we have never had that conversation in Time Magazine, frankly. And I don't, and it's funny, like it's something that maybe we should have. Although it's also a little bit weird. I'm not privy to a lot of this stuff because I'm in the DC bureau, and like the New York like mothership is like a whole other universe. Right. And so maybe they have had that conversation in New York. I have no idea. It would be an interesting thing if they did. I think that it's problematic sometimes to enforce. I think it depends on your culture, right, and where you're going. So, and there are just frankly places where women aren't right now, right? So if you're doing a story on like training Navy SEALs, there are not that many women you're going to get to speak to that. And then you'd have to go get a waiver to like say, do you have to then go get a waiver to say, I can't have a woman source in the story, that kind of thing.
And I think I'm sorry, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, I do think, though, that if you want to bring about change, you've got to be really clear about what that change is. So if we want to have a media that is more representative, that more of the voices of America, if you're talking about America, are being reflected in the news that's being written, then the high-ups, the management, the whatever you want to call them, the people with the power, need to make sure that that's a priority. And maybe not having set quotas, because sometimes that would be difficult, but putting that out there to say that that's something that's important to us. You will be given more stories, you'll be given better opportunities if you are also making super efforts to include more diverse voices. I know with SheSource, so with SheSource we send out a list every week, and I will not send a list out unless it's 40% women of colour, because for us it's important.
But I also just want to make a point that we've made a lot of progress in media, certainly, like in the last few years. And when I first joined the White House Press Corps in 2002, there were like very few women who were covering the White House. And by the end of the Obama administration, you had the president doing an entire press conference where he called only on women. You see it with how women are calling out Fox News, or calling out Mark Halperin, or calling out media these days. We are reaching that tipping point, and I think that it's very clear that this is an industry which is seeing enormous amounts of women's voices being heard every day. I would say my bigger concern is that there are other industries where this isn't trickling down to. I've had people write to me on Twitter, people write to me, letters saying, that's great that white women who are in power situations get to be not sexually harassed anymore. What about all the women who are working in as domestics? What about all the women who are working in hotels? What about women who are cleaners who get sexually harassed every day? Who's championing them? Who's helping them out of those situations? And I think there's a lot more work to be done across the board, not just in media.
I agree, and I think it all goes back to everyone working together, having transparency about what's working, what's not, across sectors, across industries, so that we're sharing more of the ideas. And I think in terms of the media, consumers are driving a lot of the change, and especially as we look at younger consumers, they're finding their own new outlets and finding voices, and there's dangers in that too. But certainly we can look to them and the sources where they're finding stories that speak to them. I do want to give, I know we're running over, so I apologize. I want to give you guys one closing statement on what do you hope the stories we're telling in 10 years are? Or just where do you think we'll be in 10 years? That might be a loaded question.
I mean,
not in time we
there's
have,
like hope and reality. My hope, just given my background, is that there is going to be a lot more parity and equity given to women-led startups, particularly women of color. Like I said, this impacts innovation throughout the world. And I'm just going to give you like a really quick example. We've had 2,000 women-led startups come through our Women's Startup Challenges, and they are developing technology to help physicians diagnose breast cancer within seconds with a 99% accuracy rate. Could you imagine the global impact if that got funded at scale, what that would happen for women and men? They also get diagnosed with breast cancer throughout the world. And then if you took that technology and then you adapted it to all different forms of cancer, we would actually be able to diagnose cancer at record rates and diagnose them early and help people survive longer. We have another startup that is using artificial intelligence to tow away dead satellites in space so that they don't knock out the world's power grids and so that they don't knock out the world's internet. These are game-changing startups that have global impact throughout the world. And so in 10 years, I hope that I'm not sitting up on this panel talking about
That was really
talking
good.
about this problem, and that these women would have been funded, they would have been scaled, and we would be seeing a major impact in the world.
I would hope for 10 years that our girls and young women are not, and older women, are not having to face a culture of sexual harassment and pressure for them in every walk of life, whether, as you're saying, it's when they're going to a hotel room to clean it or whether it's they're applying for a job in a media company. But one thing I would say to help get more women into power, which I think is about the only way we're really going to make that change, if everybody makes a really concerted effort to say that every time you tweet somebody or retweet somebody or share something on Facebook, you do at least 50% women than you do men. Because even that little change can help bring the profiles of the women up there. So that's a challenge to everybody.
Thank you.
I'm going to make a bold prediction and say that I think that in 10 years' time, we might be approaching parity. And the reason why I believe this is that in my own book research is that we are facing a demographic cliff, which is coming as America ages. And so by 2030, the last of the baby boomer generation will turn 70. And America will actually be short 26 million workers, which is kind of hard to imagine right now, considering the recent global financial crisis. But the only two ways to fill that shortfall is really bring in new immigration, which with this administration is kind of hard to imagine, or you bring women up to full employment. And bringing women up to full employment solves that hole by almost completely. That brings in 23 million new workers into the workforce, and so that brings us basically to parity, which I think is really exciting. And I think it's amazing to think of women at this point in time. It was economic necessity that brought us into the workforce with Rosie the Riveters. And I think it'll be economic necessity that brings us fully into the workforce, at the very least a critical mass, if not approaching parity in the next 10 years, which I think is awesome.
Great. Well, thank you guys. I cannot thank Gwen, Elise. This was amazing. Thank you for the index and having us. I know we ran over. I apologize.
I'll just take the opportunity to thank all of the panelists and to thank you, Liz, for moderating a great discussion. And I look forward to having everyone back here 10 years from now where we can talk not about parity, but about great leadership, new inventions, and all the exciting unexplored frontiers. Have a great afternoon and stay warm, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.